The world always seems quieter in autumn, as if the wind itself hesitates before sweeping away the last golden leaves. The morning my phone rang with the news, I was standing at my kitchen window, watching gray clouds drift across the Seattle sky. My hands were wrapped around a mug of coffee, still too hot to drink, and the steam curled upward like the memories that would not let me go. It was my mother's voice on the line, clipped and steady. "Emily," she said, "skipping any greeting, your grandfather passed away last night." She paused just long enough for the weight of her words to sink in. I felt my chest tighten, an ache I hadn't prepared for, though we all knew Grandpa's health had been failing for months. I murmured something, maybe "I'm sorry" or "I know," but she'd already moved on to logistics, her tone businesslike. The funeral would be Friday, at the old stone chapel near Green Lake, where the family always goes. The days before the service blurred into each other, endless phone calls, arrangements, the gentle but persistent drizzle that marks Seattle's fall. I found myself wandering through my apartment, touching objects as if they might anchor me, my grandfather's faded business card tucked into my wallet, the photo of us grinning on my college graduation day, his arms slung awkwardly around my shoulders. For all his gruffness, Grandpa Robert had always made me feel seen in a family where silence often passed for affection. On the morning of the funeral, I dressed in dark navy, more out of respect than any rule, and pulled my hair into a low twist. The air outside bit at my cheeks as I walked to my car, the sidewalk slick with leaves. Traffic was slow, but I barely noticed. My mind drifted between memories and the uncertainty of what came next. The chapel was just as I remembered, weathered stone, stained glass windows casting dim colors across the pews. People gathered in quiet clusters, their voices low. I spotted my mother near the front, immaculate in a tailored black coat, her mouth set in a firm line. My stepfather Mark hovered close, offering silent support, while my younger siblings, Sophie and Michael, sat stiffly beside her. They looked older than the last time I'd seen them, as if the months apart had pressed the years forward. The service was simple. The pastor spoke about legacy and kindness, reading a psalm that Grandpa used to recite at holiday dinners. The words washed over me, and I found myself blinking back tears when Sophie reached for my hand, her fingers cold but steady. After the final hymn, we moved in a slow procession to the small cemetery behind the chapel. Rain threatened but never quite fell, hanging heavy in the air. Back in the chapel's modest reception hall, people spoke in careful tones, remembering Grandpa's stubborn wit and generosity. I drifted from group to group, smiling and nodding, letting their memories fill the space where my own words failed. Mark poured coffee into styrofoam cups, Sophie nibbled at a plate of cookies without tasting them, and Michael stood by the door, shoulders hunched, as if bracing himself against a storm. It was only as people began to trickle out that I noticed my mother motioning to me from across the room. "Emily," she said, voice low but insistent, "we need to speak privately." She led me down a narrow hall to the pastor's office, where a small table sat beneath a faded oil painting of Mount Rainier. There, waiting in a neat stack, were several envelopes, one addressed in Grandpa's careful script, the other marked for the family attorney. My mother slid the attorney's envelope into her purse, fingers tightening around it. "The will is being read tomorrow morning at Peterson and Grant's office," she said, almost dismissively. "You'll need to be there." I nodded, unsure what to expect. Our family had always been comfortable, but never extravagant. Grandpa's hardware stores had done well, but he wore old jackets and preferred potluck dinners to restaurants with tablecloths. Still, There was a current in my mother's voice I'd never heard before, something clipped, hungry, restless. The next morning, rain streaked my car windows as I drove downtown. The attorney's office was paneled in dark wood and smelled faintly of leather and paper. My mother and Mark sat side by side. Sophie and Michael flanked them. I felt oddly alone, even in this small room crowded with people I'd known my whole life. Mr. Peterson, silver-haired and meticulous, adjusted his glasses and read through the formalities. Small bequests, a set of golf clubs for Michael, a pearl necklace for Sophie, a framed photograph for my mother. Then he paused, clearing his throat. To my granddaughter, Emily Carter, I leave the remainder of my estate, including all business holdings, investment accounts, and property, with the exception of items otherwise designated. The silence that followed was absolute. I stared at my hands, the weight of the words pressing into my skin. My mother's eyes snapped to mine, sharp, questioning, disbelieving. "There must be some mistake," she said, her voice barely controlled. "Read it again." Mr. Peterson obliged, his voice even. "Your father was quite clear, Mrs. Carter." I could feel my pulse in my throat as my mother's composure wavered, a fine tremor at the corner of her mouth. Mark placed a hand on her arm, but she shook it off. Sophie stared at the floor. Michael wouldn't meet my eyes. Afterward, in the hallway, my mother's mask slipped. She caught my elbow, steering me aside. Her voice was ice. "This isn't over, Emily. Don't think for a second you'll get to keep all of this. Family comes first. You should remember that." I wanted to say something, anything, but the words tangled inside me. The air felt heavy, as if a storm had gathered just for us. Later that night, back in my apartment, I unpacked my purse and found the sealed envelope Grandpa had left me. My hands shook as I slid a letter opener beneath the flap. The paper inside was thick, the ink dark and steady. "My dear Emily," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then you know I've trusted you with something precious, not just money, but the sum of all I've learned. This family's future and your own happiness depend on the choices you make from here on." I read the words again and again, searching for reassurance, for some invisible thread to guide me forward. The night outside my window deepened, the lights of the city blurring in the mist. Somewhere in the quiet, I felt my grandfather's presence, a warmth that outlasted even the hardest goodbyes. Some mornings, the darkness lingers even as you reach for the light. That winter, it seemed like the sky over Seattle had forgotten how to turn blue. I woke to the familiar trill of my phone vibrating on the nightstand, its screen glowing in the half-light of dawn. I fumbled to silence it, already guessing who it was. The screen was filled with missed calls and terse messages from my mother. "We need to talk. Call me as soon as you're awake." Another, "You're making a mistake, Emily. Call me now." It was barely 6:30 a.m., but she'd already started her campaign for the day. I sat up, wrapped a woolen throw around my shoulders, and made my way to the kitchen. The old floorboards creaked under my feet, the radiator clanking to life. I poured myself coffee and tried to collect my thoughts, though it was hard to ignore the persistent hum of my phone as more texts arrived. The apartment felt smaller lately, each message pressing in on me. By the time I reached for my phone, there were 7 missed calls and 3 new voicemails. I pressed play, bracing myself. The first was measured, almost reasonable. "Emily, it's your mother. I just want to discuss what's fair for everyone. Call me back, please." The second was more pointed. "You know this isn't what Grandpa wanted. The family should be taken care of." The third, her voice cracking with frustration. "I don't know what's gotten into you. Are you really going to let your brother and sister struggle while you keep everything for yourself? I tried to swallow the guilt, but it rose in my throat anyway. I knew my mother's tricks. She'd been using them for years, sometimes subtle, sometimes not, but they still had the power to make me feel like a disobedient child. I stared out the window, watching snowflakes drift past the glass, and wondered if the world outside felt as cold as I did. Later that morning, after another round of texts, I bundled up and walked to Grandpa's old house. It was the first time I'd returned since the will was read, and the neighborhood felt both familiar and distant. Icicles hung from the gutters, and the air bit at my cheeks. The key turned stiffly in the lock, and as I stepped inside, the quiet was almost overwhelming. The house was as I remembered, books stacked in the hall, the faint scent of pipe tobacco lingering in the study. I walked through each room slowly, letting memories settle around me. Holiday dinners, whispered conversations, Grandpa's booming laugh when I'd finally bested him at cards. In his study, the desk was just as he'd left it, covered in neat piles of paperwork and ledgers. My fingers brushed over the worn leather, searching for answers. I began gathering documents, scanning receipts and statements, trying to make sense of the tangled finances that had defined the last years of his life. That afternoon, as dusk settled, I called David Wilson, Grandpa's oldest friend. He answered on the second ring, his voice gentle. "Emily, I wondered when I'd hear from you." David invited me over, and I found myself sitting in his kitchen, surrounded by the warm, yeasty smell of bread fresh from the oven. He poured me tea and waited as I stumbled through an explanation of my mother's demands and my own confusion. He listened quietly, then excused himself, returning with a battered shoebox. "Your grandfather asked me to hold on to this, just in case." Inside, I found a thick journal, pages filled in Grandpa's steady handwriting. "He kept track of everything," David said, "especially in the last few years. Loans, gifts, arguments. He wanted you to know the truth if it ever came to it." I ran my hands over the cover, feeling the weight of secrets and love inside. "Thank you," I said quietly, blinking back tears. Back home, I sat at the kitchen table and opened the journal. Page after page, Grandpa had recorded dates, amounts, reasons for each gift or payment. Sometimes his notes trailed into personal reflections, his disappointment, his hopes for our family, his fears for my mother. I read until my eyes blurred and the apartment seemed to shrink around me. It was past midnight when I finally reached out to Anna Collins, an attorney I'd once met through a college friend. I'd been putting it off, not wanting to admit how serious things had become, but now the knot in my chest wouldn't let me rest. Her email reply was prompt and reassuring. "Come by my office tomorrow. Bring any documents you have. We'll talk through your options." The next morning, the city was dusted in fresh snow. I took the bus downtown, clutching Grandpa's journal and a folder of bank statements. Anna's office was bright, filled with potted plants and soft light. She offered me a mug of peppermint tea and listened as I poured out the whole story, from the funeral to the phone calls, the pressure, and the fear. Anna was calm, thoughtful. "Emily," she said, "it's not uncommon for families to challenge a will, especially when significant assets are involved. Your grandfather seems to have prepared well, but your mother may still try to claim undue influence or mismanagement. That's why it's important you keep detailed records, emails, messages, voicemails, everything." I nodded, relief and anxiety warring in my chest. "I just wish it didn't have to be like this. I never wanted a fight." Anna's smile was gentle. "Sometimes standing up for yourself is the bravest thing you can do, especially when it means honoring someone else's trust. Remember, You're not alone in this. And you have more support than you think. The meeting left me steadier, though not entirely at peace. On the way home, the city seemed quieter, muffled by the snow. I wondered how long this would last, how many more calls, how many more nights spent staring at the ceiling, rehearsing conversations I'd never have the courage to say aloud. That evening, just as I settled in with a bowl of soup and Grandpa's journal, my phone buzzed again. A new voicemail from my mother, her tone darker, more urgent. "You're making a mistake, Emily. There will be consequences if you keep ignoring your family. Don't say I didn't warn you." I stared at the phone, the message playing in my mind long after the screen went dark. The snow outside fell harder, thickening the silence. But somewhere, in the hush of my apartment, I felt the first flicker of resolve. I wouldn't let fear decide for me, not anymore. By the time the cherry trees along the avenue began to bloom again, I felt as though I'd aged a decade. The world outside was suddenly soft pink and new, but inside, I was bracing for the next round. I tucked Grandpa's journal into my bag, slipped on a cardigan, and walked to the cafe on Market Street, a place that still felt safe, even as everything else seemed uncertain. Anna had chosen a corner table by the window. She wore a navy blazer and an easy smile that made me feel, if not calm, at least less alone. The air was filled with the rich scent of coffee and the distant clatter of cups. Outside, petals drifted on the breeze, collecting in blushing drifts along the curb. "Hazelnut latte for you, right?" Anna asked, already ordering at the counter. I nodded, grateful for her attention to detail. We settled in, my hands wrapped around the mug for warmth. Anna got straight to the point, leafing through copies of Grandpa's records and the stack of messages from my mother. "Linda's tactics are classic pressure. She's counting on you to give up before this really begins. But the documentation you have is strong. Your grandfather's notes are meticulous." I nodded, absorbing every word. I keep waiting for this all to just fade away. Like she'll wake up and realize how unfair she's being. Anna's look was sympathetic, but firm. I wish it worked that way. But family wounds run deep. My job is to make sure you're protected and that his wishes are respected. Before she left, Anna handed me a folder. "This is a list of what to document moving forward. Every message, every call. And Emily, if you ever need a second opinion or just someone to talk to, you know where to find me." As she stepped out into the sunshine, Jason slid into her empty seat, a little breathless. He wore his favorite gray sweater, hair mussed from the breeze. Without a word, he reached for my hand across the table, his palm warm and solid. "You okay?" he asked, voice gentle. I smiled, a little surprised by the strength in my own voice. "I think so. It helps having someone on my side." Jason squeezed my fingers. "You know, I used to think family was just about blood. But sometimes, it's about who stays when things get rough." We sat in companionable silence, watching the city go about its business. A toddler giggled at a pair of sparrows. Baristas called out orders, the scent of cinnamon rolls wafted by. It struck me in that ordinary moment how much I wanted to protect what Grandpa had worked so hard to build, not just for myself, but for the part of our family that could still be saved. As we gathered our things, my phone buzzed again, another message from Mom. This one was longer, more desperate, talking about loyalty and duty and how she couldn't understand what had happened to the girl she raised. I read it silently, feeling a mixture of sadness and exhaustion. Jason put a reassuring arm around my shoulder as we stepped outside. Later that afternoon, I wandered through the park, cherry petals collecting at my feet, and let my mind drift back to Grandpa's lessons. I remembered him standing in the hardware store, showing me how to balance the register, his voice full of pride. It's not just numbers on a page, Em. It's about trust. You honor that, and you'll always find your way. The sun was warm, the air sweet. I pulled out my notebook and jotted down a few of my own thoughts, careful to mark each date, just like Grandpa had. Back at my apartment, I found an envelope slipped under my door. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable, my mother's, neat and determined. Inside was a letter, formal and clipped, requesting my presence at a family meeting to discuss the estate. The words felt cold, each sentence a little sharper than the last. I sat on the edge of my bed, reading it twice, then a third time. There was no room for kindness, only command. For a moment, fear fluttered in my chest. Then, slowly, I exhaled. This was the battle I hadn't chosen, but it was mine to face. Outside, the sun dipped behind the hills, casting long shadows over the city. I placed the letter on my desk beside Grandpa's journal, determined to carry both into whatever came next. On the morning of the meeting, the fog lay heavy over Seattle, blurring the edges of every house and tree as I drove through my old neighborhood. My hands were steady on the wheel, but my stomach churned. Linda's street looked unchanged, lined with perfect lawns and trees just beginning to turn. Still, the sight of her house, so carefully curated, so full of memories, brought a tightening to my chest I couldn't shake. I parked at the curb and sat for a moment, watching the condensation bead across the windshield. The house loomed, its white columns and red door polished for company. Early autumn light slanted through heavy curtains as I rang the bell. Sophie answered, her smile polite but wary, and motioned for me to come in. Inside, the air was cool and scented faintly with lavender. The living room was staged for drama. Family portraits glimmered on the mantel, plush carpets muffled every step. Mark stood by the fireplace, his arms crossed. Michael hovered near the window, hands shoved deep in his pockets. My mother, Linda, sat in her favorite chair, back ramrod straight, flanked by two men in tailored suits. The tension in the room felt almost physical, pressing in from all sides. Emily, you're right on time, Linda said, her voice smooth as polished glass. Let's get started, shall we? I took the only open seat, carefully placing my bag at my feet. My phone, set to silent, buzzed just once, a text from Anna, reminding me she was a phone call away. One of the lawyers, Mr. Campbell, began with pleasantries, but there was no warmth in the words. Linda wasted little time. She produced a stack of papers, sliding them across the coffee table toward me. These are the transfer documents. We thought it best to resolve this privately, for everyone's sake. I glanced at the paperwork, careful not to let my expression slip. Privately, I echoed, but with your legal team present. Linda didn't blink. We're just being thorough. You know how complicated estates can be. Mark nodded, offering a ghost of a smile. Sophie and Michael watched in silence, the former picking at her nails, the latter unable to meet my gaze. I turned to the first page, scanning legalese that danced with phrases like irrevocable transfer, good faith, and family equity. My heart beat steadily, but my mind felt razor sharp. I flipped to the section on assets and saw, as expected, an attempt to cede all authority to Linda as executor, with vague promises of equitable distribution. I looked up. Did you draft these yourselves? I asked, meeting Linda's eyes. Our advisors helped, she replied, her voice still sweet, but something tense flickered at the corner of her mouth. Mr. Campbell cleared his throat, We've included terms that ensure the whole family benefits, Emily. There's no need for anyone to be left out. I took a slow breath. But there's also no guarantee of what happens next. Just trust. Linda leaned forward, her tone sharpening. We are your family. Trust is the foundation of all we have left. That word echoed in my mind. Trust. I remembered Grandpa's words, soft but insistent, as he taught me to balance ledgers. Trust isn't given, it's earned. Protect what matters, but don't let bitterness take root. I laid the pen down, refusing to touch the documents. I can't sign this. Grandpa left me his wishes in writing, and I intend to honor them. Linda's composure finally cracked, just a little. You're making this harder than it needs to be. From my bag, I pulled Grandpa's journal and placed it gently on the table. He recorded everything, I said. Every gift, every loan, every promise. I have records of every transfer and conversation. If you want to contest this, you'll need to answer to more than just me. You'll need to answer to his legacy. A beat of silence hung in the air. The lawyers shifted uncomfortably. Mark's face flushed. Sophie pressed her lips together, her eyes darting from me to Linda. Linda's expression hardened. You're going to regret this. You think you know better than your own mother. I think Grandpa trusted me for a reason, I replied softly. And I won't betray that trust, no matter how much you threaten. The room, once full of forced politeness, bristled with old wounds. Michael spoke for the first time, voice quiet. Can't we talk about this like a family? Linda cut him off, her tone frigid. Not if Emily refuses to act like family. That stung, but I let it pass. Family isn't just about sharing the same name, I said quietly. It's about showing up for each other, even when it's hard. I'm still here, Mom. I'm just not giving in. Linda stood abruptly, snatching the documents from the table. This isn't over, she hissed, her mask slipping away entirely. Not by a long shot. She swept from the room, the sound of her heels sharp against the hardwood. The two lawyers gathered their briefcases, mumbling excuses, and followed her out. Mark trailed behind, his face drawn. Sophie lingered at the door, her voice barely a whisper. I'm sorry, Em. I didn't want it to be like this. I squeezed her hand gently. It's not your fault. Michael watched me for a moment, his expression uncertain. What do we do now? We hold on, I said, more to myself than anyone else. We hold on and do the right thing. As the house emptied, I felt the hush settle, no longer tense, but fragile, as if the walls themselves had exhaled. I stepped out onto the porch, letting the autumn air cool my cheeks, and heard Linda's car engine roar to life. The family portraits inside would bear witness to what had just unfolded, silent as ever. But I was steadier than I'd been in years. I'd stood my ground, not with anger, but with the quiet certainty Grandpa had tried so hard to give me. Behind me, the door clicked shut, and I walked into the thickening dusk, the promise of another battle lingering in Linda's final words. After the family meeting, the world seemed to slow to a hush. Even the rain, steady and relentless against my apartment windows, couldn't quite drown out the echo of old wounds. I moved through the days as if wrapped in a heavy coat, doing the work, keeping the routines, but feeling a dull ache in the center of it all. The first crack in the silence came from Michael. He texted me late one evening, asking if we could talk. The message was awkward, just a simple "you home," and yet it startled me more than any threat. I put on a kettle, waiting for the knock I hoped would come. Michael arrived with his hands jammed deep in the pockets of his hoodie, his hair still damp from the drizzle outside. He hesitated at the door, glancing around as if expecting to see our mother lurking in the shadows. I waved him in and offered tea. "There's chamomile or something with orange peel," I said, trying to keep my voice light. He chose chamomile, and we sat on the faded blue couch, mugs cradled in our hands. He stared at the steam rising from his cup for a long time before he spoke. "I didn't know how bad it was," he finally said, his voice thin with remorse. "Mom never talked about the money. She just said you were being difficult, holding up the family." I guess I wanted to believe her. I felt a small, fragile warmth break through the numbness. It's easier to believe her version, I know. I used to too. Michael met my eyes then, his own troubled. "She's really hurting. But the way she's going about this, it's wrong. I'm sorry for not seeing it sooner." There was something in his apology, a mix of sorrow and sincerity, that soothed an ache I'd carried since childhood. I reached over, covering his hand with mine. "Thank you, Michael. I'm glad you're here." We talked quietly for a while, about Grandpa's lessons, about what family used to mean for us, about the sharp turns life takes. When he finally left, I realized for the first time in months that I didn't feel alone in my own home. A few days later, I got a message from Sophie. She asked if we could meet at her favorite little diner, an old place on the corner, all red vinyl booths and checkered floors. It was snowing lightly as I walked there, the hush of winter softening the city's sharp edges. Sophie was already there when I arrived, sitting at the window, her hands wrapped around a mug of cocoa. She looked tired, more grown up than I remembered, but also smaller, as if the weight of the past year had pressed her down. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she said softly as I slid into the booth across from her. "I wasn't sure either," I replied, offering a tentative smile. We talked around the real subject for a while, work, the weather, how the Seahawks were doing this season. Finally, she let out a long sigh and looked me full in the face. "I want to apologize," she said, her voice trembling. "For everything. For believing Mom, for saying those things about you in front of everyone. I was scared. It felt like our family was coming apart, and I blamed you because it was easier than looking at the truth." I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Sophie, I never wanted this either. But I can't undo Grandpa's wishes. And I can't fix what Mom refuses to see." She nodded, blinking away tears. "I know. I want us to be sisters again, even if it's different than before." There was a long pause, and then, almost as if on cue, we both laughed quietly, but with a kind of relief. I saw in her eyes the little girl I used to protect and the woman she was becoming. There are moments in life when forgiveness feels like the only real wealth you have. Later that week, Jason came over for dinner. He brought takeout, Thai food, fragrant and warm, and we sat at the kitchen table, sorting receipts and business plans between bites of curry. The conversation turned, as it always did, to the future, Grandpa's hardware stores, the idea of starting a charitable foundation for young people with big dreams and empty pockets. Jason tapped a pencil against his notepad. "You know, if Grandpa could see this, he'd probably make a joke about keeping it all in the family, but I think he'd be proud of you for not letting it turn you bitter." I smiled, thinking of Grandpa's old work apron, now hanging on a hook in my laundry room. "I just want to build something that matters," I said. "Not just for us, but for everyone he helped." He nodded. "Then we'll do it. Together." Even as my siblings and I began to find our footing again, Linda's presence was never far away. She kept her distance physically but made herself known online, posting cryptic messages about betrayal and greed, sometimes in all caps, sometimes layered with old family photos. Distant cousins and family friends chimed in with hearts and sad faces, their comments like little pebbles thrown into water, creating ripples I couldn't control. For the most part, I let it go. Anna advised me to document everything but not to engage. Some people shout from the rooftops because they're terrified of their own silence, she'd said, with a wisdom I was only just beginning to appreciate. Then, late one evening as I cleaned the kitchen, my phone buzzed with a message from Sophie. "Check your email," she'd written. I did, and found a long letter, honest, raw, full of regret and hope. She talked about her dreams, her doubts, and how she was learning to trust herself again. It was a kind of healing I hadn't known I needed. The next morning, as the city woke beneath a gentle snowfall, a message arrived from my mother. "Let's talk. No lawyers." The words were short, careful, but something in their tone felt different, less like a summons, more like a reaching out. I stared at the screen for a long time, the warmth from my mug seeping into my hands. Outside, Michael's old car rumbled into the parking lot, headlights glinting on fresh snow. Inside, the apartment was full of small, ordinary sounds, tea kettle hissing, radiator clinking, Jason humming a tune under his breath. It struck me then how families are built not in grand gestures, but in these quiet, sometimes messy, acts of trying again. Sometimes, forgiveness is less about erasing the past and more about choosing to move forward together. I took a deep breath, watching the snow pile softly against the windowsill, and began to type my reply. Spring came early that year, sweeping Seattle with a gentler light and the kind of hope that sneaks in quietly after a long storm. On the morning of our new store's grand opening, I stood just inside the glass doors, nerves humming, hands smoothing invisible creases from my dress. Colorful banners fluttered in the breeze, balloons danced above a crowd of neighbors, and laughter tumbled through the air, warm and honest. The smell of fresh paint mixed with cinnamon rolls from the bakery down the street, and outside, the sound of a jazz trio floated between greetings. Michael wrangled a stubborn streamer, Sophie organized boxes of donated tools for the raffle, and Jason darted around with a clipboard, beaming as he greeted volunteers. For the first time in a long while, I felt us coming together, not because we were forced to, but because we wanted to. Anna arrived just before the speeches began, giving me a quick, encouraging hug. "You did it, Emily," she whispered, pride shining in her eyes. As the mayor wrapped up his welcome, I found my place at the makeshift podium, a slab of polished wood from Grandpa's first store, lovingly restored for this day. I scanned the crowd, heart racing, and caught sight of Linda standing near the back, a little apart but present, her coat buttoned to the chin. She looked older somehow, but softer, her gaze open and searching. I cleared my throat and the chatter stilled. "Thank you all for being here today," I began, my voice carrying farther than I expected. "This store is more than just shelves and hardware. It's a piece of my grandfather's dream, a place built on trust, on community, on second chances. He believed that when you lift others, you build something that lasts far beyond your own time." As I spoke, sunlight spilled across the floor, catching on the glass display and making it glow. I talked about Grandpa's legacy, but also about where we were going next, how Michael and Jason would manage the stores, how Sophie was helping to launch new workshops, and how, together, we were starting the Matthews Foundation to help young entrepreneurs find their footing. The crowd applauded, and for a moment, my heart ached with gratitude for their belief in us and for the quiet strength that had carried me here. After the ceremony, I drifted from group to group, shaking hands, sharing stories, hugging friends I hadn't seen in years. Linda lingered at the edge of the crowd. Finally, as the afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the parking lot, she approached me. We stood beside the new sign, Matthew's Hardware, in proud, painted letters. "Congratulations," Linda said quietly, her voice softer than I remembered. "Your grandfather would be proud." I studied her face, seeing the lines of worry softened by something like humility. "Thank you for coming, Mom," I replied, the words simple but sincere. She hesitated, searching my eyes. I'm sorry, Emily. For everything. I can't fix what's been broken, but I want to try." Her voice was thin, edged with uncertainty. I reached out, taking her hand. "Trying is enough. We'll figure the rest out as we go." For a moment, neither of us spoke. All around us, laughter mingled with music, and the air was filled with the clink of glasses, the sizzle of a barbecue, and the hopeful chatter of a new season. Michael waved us over, and Sophie hurried up with a plate of cookies, insisting Linda take one. Jason joined us, his smile bright with possibility. We stood together, awkward but willing, the past not erased, but softened by our choice to show up again and again. Later, as dusk settled and the last of the guests trickled out, I walked through the empty aisles, fingertips tracing new shelves, breathing in the scent of sawdust and hope. At the front window, I caught Linda's gaze as she stood on the sidewalk, and in that unguarded moment, we shared a look not of regret, but of beginning. Maybe reconciliation isn't a single act, but 1,000 small choices, a willingness to stay, to forgive, to build something better from what's left behind. As I locked the doors that night, I felt the weight of the years lift, replaced by a quiet strength I knew would last. The legacy Grandpa left wasn't just the store or the money. It was the love we chose to carry forward, one day at a time. Standing in the quiet glow of our new store, I realized that true inheritance isn't measured by what we receive, but by what we give and build together. Through all the storms, forgiveness and small acts of kindness slowly healed what money could not. In families, choosing to listen and offer grace, especially when it's hard, often means more than winning any argument. If my story reminds you of your own, I hope you'll remember that it's never too late to reach out, to rebuild, or to find peace in the simple act of caring. Feel free to share your thoughts or memories below. Sometimes, a shared story is the start of new understanding.